nanoseconds, look at all the stuff that makes up this waveform. There's a low part to the waveform, there's a high part to the waveform, then it has to go up and it has to go down. Okay, so let's just think about this up, this rising part. Okay, it can't be 0.3 nanoseconds, right? That's the whole period. So let's say that rising part is maybe like 50 picoseconds, which is 0.05 nanosecond. Let me keep it in terms of nanoseconds. 0.05 nanoseconds. So it took, it took 0.05 nanoseconds for the rise time of this thing, and it took 10 nanoseconds for this to cross from one IC to the other one. So for sure, this guy doesn't see this immediately, right? Doesn't see it going from low to high immediately. It's like waiting for a long time before that edge arrives, okay? So in this case, you do have to use a transmission line. It's pretty clear in this case, because if I was using a lumped line, it would say that if my input's at 0 and it's starting to go up to 1 volt, I pretty much see the same thing at the same time. Think about a lumped model. That's what it, if I have a voltage source and I'm like looking at a capacitor, I'm assuming those two are happening at the same time, right? This is clearly a case when it's not. This is clearly a case of a transmission line case, where there's a distance for this, there's a length of time for the travel from these two. Okay, so how do we generally think about that? Well, so in the form, so this is just an important rule of thumb, I feel, for microelectronics, because in microelectronics you deal with square waves. Okay, so in microelectronics you deal with things that look like that in terms of voltage and time. And if you take the square wave and you do a Fourier transform to see all the different frequencies that this thing is made out of, it'll have like a bunch of frequencies, because you'll have a bunch of sines and cosines make up the square wave. Okay, so when you're thinking in terms of what are the important frequencies for the square wave, so generally if I do a frequency transformation for the square wave, I'll end up with some kind of a wave. This is frequency, guys. So this is frequency, this is time. So I did a frequency transformation, okay? Typically people say, I'm gonna pick a certain, and this frequencies go on for like infinity, okay? But they say the majority of the interesting information in this frequency space is limited to something I'm going to call F max. And a rule of thumb is that is equal to 0.25 over what's called the rise time to about 0.35 over the rise time. And the rise time is the amount of time it took for the signal to rise from a 0 to 1, or 1 to 0 for transition then. Okay, so that lets you kind of, again, as a rule of thumb, so this is rule of thumb, about important frequency ranges for a digital signal. And why is this range? It just depends on, because the rule of thumb, if you're a conservative person, you'll pick 0.35 over the rise time, because it's a longer frequency. And if you're a cowboy, you'll pick 0.25 over the rise time. No? So that's a rule of thumb. Okay? So there is an inverse relationship between frequency and wavelength. Okay, so lambda, the wavelength, times the frequency is the speed of light. You guys remember this? This is like God-given. Now the speed of light is different media, right? So you have to worry about the speed of light in, whether it's in your printed circuit board or is in vacuum or in space and so on. So if I have an F max, if I have this F max, it corresponds to a lambda min. That's the shortest wavelength I'm going to worry about for that rise time waveform. You guys with me? So, you guys are not with me. So if you have a waveform, right? You say, this is, so should we do this? Let's do it. What the heck? Because I'm talking in generalities. So let's say my rise time is 100 picoseconds or 0.1 nanoseconds. Okay, for a waveform, for that same clock waveform, right? So this is probably 2 gigahertz clock. Okay, so F max, the fastest frequency I'm going to worry about in this case, I'm kind of a conservative guy. So it'll be 0.35 over 0.1 nanoseconds. Should be able to do this. I think it's going to be, oh, God knows what it'll be. I think it's going to be 30. Is it 3.5 gigahertz? Yeah, get that right. That's 3.5 gigahertz. Okay, so if I have a square wave with 100 picosecond rise time, most of the important frequencies that make up that square wave are in this 3.5 gigahertz type of frequency range. Guys with me? Okay. Do you guys remember the speed of light? I think it's 300,000 kilometers per second, right? No? Anybody remember this? 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second?
Yeah, I think so.
Okay, good. So lambda times F is C. Okay, so lambda is 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second over 3.5 gigahertz. And then hertz, remember hertz is 1 over seconds. So I'm going to say giga per second, giga 1 over seconds. Okay, so that is 3e to the 8th, enter 3.5, e to the 9th, divide. So that is 0.0857 meters. So let's call that 8 centimeters. Did I get that right? 8 centimeters. So that's this lambda min. No, sorry guys, that's not 8 centimeters, is it? Yeah, 8 centimeters. Okay, so the rule of thumb is that when L, let's see, when L is much, this is the length of the transmission line. So when the length of transmission line I call that L. So when L is much smaller than lambda min, you can use lumped. Model. What does much smaller than means? For me means 0.1x. So when, in this case, when L is less than 0.1 times 8 centimeters, so that's, what is that, 0.8 millimeters? We can use a lumped model. Does that make sense? Think about 0.8 millimeter. Millimeter is like this, okay? I wish I brought a printed circuit board. Like, your chips are never this far apart. They're usually like that far apart. Okay, so when you have these gigahertz signals, even if things are sitting that far from each other, use transmission line models, essentially, at those frequencies when you're running this fast. But let's say you had a 1 megahertz signal that you're trying to output. A 1 megahertz signal will probably can have a rise time of tens of nanoseconds, right? Though a megahertz clock is 1 times 10, mega is 1 times 10 to the 6th. Okay, so it's 3 orders of magnitude slower, sorry, 3? Yeah, 3 orders of magnitude slower than what we're talking about. Okay, so now the distances, so 3 orders of magnitude bigger than millimeter is a meter. Okay, so when you're trying to drive like, you know, like a megahertz, 10 megahertz signals, you can use pretty much like a lumped model. You don't have to worry about transmission lines till you get into 2, 3, 4, 5 meters. You guys see this sort of like, this is kind of this rule of thumb. So that's why I think it's important, because this is like a question you'll run into. It's like, when do I get into this complex calculation? Okay.
So,
What else do I want to say? Yeah. Uh-huh.
So if talking about the rule of thumb, that means it depends on it's a combination of frequency and length. So it could be a short distance, but if the frequency is high enough, then we have to use long.
That's right. That's right.
And just like we can have a longer length, but because of lower frequency, we can still use like a
Yeah. Yeah. Yeah, but this is like, you guys can see how, so the way historically, I think I kind of mentioned this, historically, I think people came up with electromagnetic waves first, then we came up with like transmission line models and then lumped models. The reason why you go into these different models to explain the same thing is each one is easier, much easier to use than the other one, right? So like a lumped model is just R's, C's, and L's and stuff. If I'm sure if I took a poll here, you guys would agree that that's a much easier thing to do than the transmission line models we're using right now, right? So this is actually a pretty important question when you run across something to decide if am I going to do a transmission line calculation or a lumped model, because it'll affect how much engineering time you'll have to spend on the same activities, the same thing. You want to get a signal from here to there, and if in the real world you're wrong and use a transmission line model when you didn't have to, your boss will go, why did you spend all day doing transmission line equations that were just, I can just do it on a piece of paper here in like 2 seconds and figure out what this needs to be. What were you doing all day? The reverse of that is if you use a simple lumped model and build your system and it doesn't work now because of reflections and sources and losses and stuff, the same boss, why is the boss always the bad guy? He's really your partner. No, I'm just kidding. Then he'll be going like, why did you spend all this money building up this thing when it was pretty obvious it was never going to work because of these transmission line effects? So this is like really an important point of making a decision about when to use transmission lines versus when to use lumped elements. And we actually end up with a similar point when we go from transmission line models to full electromagnetic wave equations. At some point you're going to have to say, because each one, I'm just making this up, but you almost can think of each one being an order of magnitude more engineering time needed to do the analysis, right? So if it takes you, 20 minutes to do a lumped calculation, maybe 10, 15 minutes to do a lumped equation, it'll take you all day to do a transmission line simulation model, whatnot, right? And then it'll probably take you all week to do a electromagnetic wave finite element analysis and calculation, okay? So that's a pretty important decision you make at the beginning of it about where you are, okay? So just one last thing is these are like pretty solid lines, but again, in real life, there are places where there's like a gray zone, okay? So just like we have this L being around 0.1 lambda min, or less than equal to that, it's lumped, for sure. If L let's see, what's the rule of thumb I want to use for that? Is greater than equal, again, rule of thumb, 40 times C times the rise time, you do a transmission line.
Professor, what is C?
Yeah. Oh, C is the speed of light.
Oh, so
By the way, this is another really important thing, guys. Again, this is a real practical hint, like you're going to get into trouble, is make sure when you use C in your calculations, again, in the real world, you don't use C for 3 times 10 to the 8th meters per second, because it depends on the material you're traveling. If you're a printed circuit board, it's about half that speed. Okay, I don't know what it is in cables, all those things. So the speed depends on the media. And you can get into some serious trouble if you use the speed of light in a vacuum when you do these calculations. Okay, so if I put in the rise time times the flight time. Flight time is how long it takes to get across the transmission line. So how long to get across transmission line. If you're at sort of a certain range, this ratio, you're in the lumped model. So this is when L is 0.1 times lambda min. And then if your flight time is longer, so L is greater than 4T CTR, you're up here. So you have kind of a gray zone in between where, you're gonna have to make a decision about which one to use. So that's just a point I wanted to make. So these are, because these are just rules of thumb, right? We're saying at 0.1 or 40 C times TR, whatever. But I think the important thing I wanted to get across again is this relationship. It depends on how fast you're running and how long you are, whether you use transmission line or lumped. And that's a very important decision to make upfront in your project. Okay, guys, so at that,